So, why don't you go ahead by starting to introduce yourself and the culture that you come from?
Okay, my name is Naomi Tesema. I'm a senior. My parents were born in Ethiopia, so I'm Ethiopian American. I was born in America.
So Naomi, when did you first come to Lovett?
I came to Lovett in 6th grade.
Okay, and so, coming from an Ethiopian family to a school like this, was there a difficult transition for you? How was the adjustment coming into Lovett, from that home culture to the new school culture?
Well, I've always been at public school, or a public school, so I've always been in an environment where I'm usually, like, the only girl from Ethiopia, or the only girl from, like, whose parents are from another country. So coming to Lovett, it wasn't really different when it came to, like, the home culture, just because I was, like, used to that my whole life. And I guess a lot of things was people just asking me, like, oh, where are you from? Once they, like, got to know me and, like, saw, like, little differences, whether it be, like, the way I looked or the way I acted, or, like, my name, because my last name isn't really American. So having people pronounce that, I guess, they would immediately think, like, oh, she's from somewhere. So just a lot of questions like that.
When we talk about, Lovett as a whole, what do you think the quote-unquote culture is here at Lovett? And, how does that kind of affect, or how does that, balance out with the culture at home?
Well, I would describe Lovett as a sort of like a preppy southern culture. So, for example, it's a lot of people here, they vacation at the same place. They usually live in the same, like, Buckhead area. So when it comes to being from a totally different culture, and especially, like, being able to speak a different language, it's not like there's a lot of people that love it. Especially when you first come here, you kind of feel a little isolated when it comes to that. But I would describe it as welcoming. And over the years, I've seen a difference in how open-minded people can be. So I've seen, like, a change. So at first, it's not, like, just questions about where are you, but, like, deeper questions like, oh, well, tell me about your culture. Like, how do you say words in your language? Like, how is that being at home? And at home, I'm used to eating, like, Ethiopian food and speaking Amharic with my parents. But my parents also speak English. We speak English just the same, too.
Now, Naomi, your aunt goes to this school, right? So tell me kind of, like, how that is, in terms of, like, a cultural dynamic and how that kind of, like, helps you be cultural at school.
Well, once people really know my aunt really well because she's been here for so long. So I think when I first came here and people, especially teachers, found out that was my aunt, it sort of, like, made them feel closer because they're like, oh, like, we know your aunt really well and you're, like her niece, so you're definitely, like, they kind of, like, welcomed me even more. And it sort of helped because, like, when I see my aunt, I always say hi to her, and sometimes, like, we speak Amharic to each other. And being in the library, like, people have sort of, like, looked back at us because they've noticed, like, we're speaking a different language. But I've loved having her here. She's always been somebody I can go to, and she's literally, like, down, like, there. So I love having her, and she's definitely, like, helped me when it comes to balancing, like, being Ethiopian and being American in general, but especially, like, being at a school at Lovett where there's not just a lot of minorities in general. So she's just always been somebody I can depend on.
So being Ethiopian and then having to live in the culture that Lovett, kind of has, in your own words, do you face any pressures between, having to be one thing and then also be another thing?
Not really. I've always been comfortable with who I am, and I think a large part of that is just because of the way I was raised. I actually think it's pretty cool. Like, I like saying that I'm Ethiopian. I'm really proud of it. I've never really tried to hide it. And I love it just because, like, my sister and I are the only Ethiopians. I'm always, like, willing to say that and proud to say that and just, like, teach people more about it. So that people can get more open-minded about it. I guess pressure-wise is feeling different, but I like being different.
Do you think the perception of Ethiopians that kids have beforehand is accurate, until they find out, whether it's different or not from their own initial perception?
Well, my experience when it comes to perceptions with, like, kids our age is a lot of them just don't really know about Ethiopian culture a lot. I think people older who like grew up in the 80s when there was like a really big famine, they have that perception of it being like a very poor country and very I guess poverty stricken and very poor. So I guess when they meet somebody from there, they think like they've lived through this whole life of struggle. And I know like my parents lived during the famine, but it's not like they were malnourished or anything, like they were fine. So I think more with kids our age it's just them knowing about Ethiopia. And then most kids that love it, if they do know a little bit about Ethiopia, it's probably just because they know of other kids in private schools who are Ethiopian, because there are a few like at Westminster and at Marist. So I feel like the perception is not only like, I think the biggest one is like, oh, you're African. So the difference between, if they think like there's a difference between being Ethiopian and African, because just in general people have sort of a construed perception of what it's like to be African, just knowing that there's a lot of different ethnicities and people there, so not all Africans look the same because it's such a huge continent and they're very different.
So, interesting, you are African, but a lot of your friends and some of the kids around the school are African American. For you, what is that difference like for you? In terms of, again, people's perception of you, and you having to balance those identities?
I think the biggest thing is being Ethiopian American, especially having parents directly from there. I'm very intertwined with my culture. Like, I have a strong sense of who I am, like where I came from. And I guess that's different for like most African Americans because it's harder to trace back your ancestry when your family has been in America for so long, since like the times of slavery and things like that. So I think like just the biggest difference is I feel more connected to being African. I'm like, if somebody asks me where I'm from, I'll say African, and then if they're like, okay, but like where, I'd say Ethiopia. Whereas opposed to, I guess, being African American, some don't really like the term African American. I've met people like that. They'd rather be called like Black American. So it's just, I guess, being connected to Africa, because I know like where my roots came from and I have a strong sense of that. And then that's not the same with some of like my friends who are Black and who consider themselves Black before saying African.
Would you ever identify as Black or African American?
I mean, I guess in a sense, because I was born in America and my ancestry is African, so I do say I'm African American. But then I was actually having like a discussion with one of my friends who's Black, and she was telling me how she thinks the term African American is sort of misconstrued because, and I agree with her, I think African American should describe people like me who they have like direct lineage from Africa and they should be African American. But I guess more Black people here who have like a mix of cultures, they're not just African, they also have white in them, they also have Native American in them. A term like Black American could be used. And that's sort of controversial, but I would consider myself, simply, like first I consider myself African and Ethiopian American.
So, here at Lovett we've had some racial incidences, and, outside of Lovett and across America we've been having those as well. Do you ever get the feeling that, those people who are Black American think that you should also be affected by those issues?
I think when it comes to those issues, just because, like, my family, especially, I think a lot of those issues are just interconnected with the history of slavery. And my family, we haven't really been affected by slavery just because we weren't living in America. I definitely know that if I looked the way I looked, 50 years ago, I would be discriminated against. And I still feel like just because for the color of my skin, I'm discriminated against. And that's, definitely still out there. It's not like I'm naive to that. But I know when my family talks about racial issues, it's sort of different from, what the average Black American family would talk about when it comes to racial issues, just because historically we don't know. I never had grandparents who went through Jim Crow. My parents never really went through, racial tensions in America. They never really experienced. They saw it on the news, so they sort of feel like an outwards from that. But I think at the end of the day, just knowing that color discrimination does exist and being aware of that is very important.
Have you ever faced, or can you tell us as an audience, a racial incident to you or to one of your family members that's been particularly, meaningful or, has had a big impact on you?
I guess the biggest thing is just being discriminated against being an immigrant more than being black. I know, like, my parents have accents, and a lot of my aunts and uncles, and my grandma doesn't even speak English. So I know for them a struggle mostly is being just an immigrant. So getting weird looks when they're talking to somebody, and I've seen it where, like, we're at a store, and if, like, my aunt is trying to speak with somebody, they just sort of pass her off as being an immigrant. A lot of my family, actually, a lot of people sort of think we're Indian sometimes. So I think that's funny, just because they sort of have more of an immigrant. So they treat us a little differently, more so that way, being an immigrant, than just being, like, black.
Have you ever faced any type of incidents here at Lovett?
No, not really. I mean, nothing, like, pronounced that I can think of. I mean, there's definitely been times, like, people have said something just about immigrants. I've heard, like, immigrant jokes and stuff like that, but nothing, like, really pronounced that, personally me, no.
Last couple set of questions. Do you find Lovett to be a place where you can kind of pursue the opportunity to learn more about your culture or to teach other people about your culture?
I think more teach people, other people. Again, my sister and I and my aunt are the only Ethiopians at the school, so people who have no idea about Ethiopia and go to Lovett, what they do know is what they get from us three. So I think that it's really important that we sort of, like, change any negative perceptions out there and just let people have, like, an open mind.
Perfect. Thank you.